Okay, I want to talk a little bit about a major disaster that occurred in London just after the turn of the last century, and this is a disaster that really isn't well known. London's a city that's seen many disasters over the years, over the centuries. We think of the King's Cross fire. We think recently of the Grenville fire. We think of the Clapham Junction train crash, the London bombings, the Moorgate disaster. These are all things that are well documented. And this year marks 30 years exactly since the Marchioness disaster, the pleasure steamer on the Thames that collided with a larger vessel, the Bowbell. Over 50 people died. But I doubt many people in London, and especially not outside London, have heard of the Colney hatch fire of 1903. Now, this is something that I was familiar with because I'd done a sort of personal study on the history of London 10 years ago. Unfortunately, I lost a lot of the work. My computer crashed and I hadn't, I lost a lot of the work. Very frustrating. But I just want to talk a little bit about this, just to spread knowledge, and because I think it's incredible that it's not better known. And I wonder, is it because this took place in a mental hospital, and is it because of who the victims were, which is very sad if true. I'm going to read out from a site called London Forgotten Disasters, which is a great site if you're interested in London's history. And it is, as it says, it's documenting London's forgotten disasters. So this was edited about 10 years ago. Last night, in a room packed with London historians, I'm just going to read this out. I'll put a link, but I'll read it out. Last night, in a room packed with London historians, we asked for a show of hands how many people had heard of the Colney Hatch Asylum fire. Only one person raised his hand, and he was a member of the London Fire Brigade. Now, before I continue, just in case you're wondering, Colney Hatch is located in what is now the London Borough of Barnet, North London. It was also known as the Frayern Hospital, or at least it was part of the Frayern Hospital. On the 27th of January 1903, so we're talking over 116 years ago now, 52 people, all female, lost their lives when a fire swept through the Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum. And that's using the term of the time. This high death toll marks the tragedy as the worst peacetime fire in London's history since the medieval period. This was writing, of course, before the Grenville fire, which claimed 72 lives. Yet it's rare to find a Londoner who's heard of it. Colney Hatch Asylum in New Southgate, operated by the London County Council, was an institution housing over 3,000 of the pauper insane. The facility had been identified as at significant fire risk by authorities. Many of the inmates were housed in temporary timber wings, and the complex was famous for its long corridors. In 1903, the inevitable happened. One of the timber wards caught fire, and aided by strong winds, the conflagration spread. The asylum's firefighting ability was limited, and the local fire authorities had to dam a stream to raise sufficient water for dousing. A press report from the Boston Evening Transcript, I assume that's Boston, Massachusetts, paints a very grim picture of the ensuing tragedy. Some of the lunatics were burned in their beds, and the charred remains of others were found huddled together in corners, while groups of partially consumed bodies on the site of the corridors showed that many persons lost their lives and sacrificed those of others in their frantic efforts to force a passage through the flames to the main building. In the early 20th century, psychiatric patients were held in very low regard, and this, I must admit, is something that shocked me. I thought by the 20th century, whilst the standards wouldn't have been as they are today, I would have thought that they would have been a bit more humane. The same press cutting offers several insights into the views of the time. Beneath the headline, 50 lunatics perish, runs the subheading, many escaped and are now at large, as though these unfortunate women were dangerous criminals. It's also noted that the fire occurred in the Jewish wing. This may have been partly for practical reasons such as shared dietary needs, but the temptation is just to suspect a prejudice, and that is speculation. There's no hard evidence for that. Very little further information can be found online. A Times cutting describes the disaster in less lurid tones. Others are gathered here, and there's I'll put a link to the article. The Wikipedia page for the institution offers just one sentence, and that's true. So there really is scant information available, considering this is one of London's worst disasters. After the fire, the Colney Hatch Asylum was renamed Frayne Hospital. Okay, my mistake, so it is the same building, but Frayne Hospital is the later term, and remained a centre for psychiatric care until closing in 1993. It opened in the early 19th century. The main buildings are now luxury apartments called Princess Park Manor. The developer's website doesn't mention the tragic fire, not surprisingly. Don't think it's from superstition. I just think that they might believe that's, people won't want to go there if they know the history. In fact, the history section makes no mention of the building's former function as an asylum. It's the Colney Hatch fire is truly one of London's forgotten disasters. I mean, this is shocking. This is a disaster in which 52 innocent women die in the most horrible way imaginable, and it's almost like it's just been whitewashed from the public consciousness, and that's tragic. I mean, we're not talking about the Dark Ages here. We're not talking about something that happened in the 14th century. This was in the 20th century. And it was London's worst fire outside of the Blitz. And outside the Middle Ages, the Great Fire of 1212 was a horrendous event, worse than the fire of 1666. But it was the worst outside those events until Grenville. Grenville surpassed it now. Grenville was 72 dead. This was 52. But before Grenville, and even now, I doubt many people have heard of it, the Colney Hatch Asylum fire. It should be much better known. Anyway, I highly recommend this website. It does give coverage to events that have largely been forgotten in London's history. Another one is the Fatal Vespers. This was a church meeting, I believe, let me just get this right, I believe it was 1627. And basically it was a building collapse. Over 100 people, or around 100 people killed. Let me just mention a little bit about this. I didn't really plan this for this video, but I may as well mention it since it is another forgotten disaster. And the Fatal Vespers, there is actually a whole Wikipedia article on this, and there's a description. It occurred in Blackfriars in the French ambassador's house, 1623, and basically the upper floor of a house collapsed under the weight of 300 people who were attending a religious service, and nearly 100 people died. So it was a building collapse. Another forgotten disaster in London's history occurred at the same time as the regicide, when an explosion occurred and over 50 people died. This was a house, and it was an explosion involving gunpowder. Nothing to do with the plot of 1605. This was the same year as the regicide in 1649. But people were thrown out of buildings. I'll see if I could get a bit more information about that, actually, if you just bear with me a second. This really is a great site, and I'll put a link to it in this video. I'm just waiting for this to load. If you just bear with me a second. Like I say, people tend to remember some better known events, but London has had really is a city that is drenched in disaster and tragedy. Another one is the Princess Alice maritime disaster, 1878. In fact, one of Jack the Ripper's victims was a survivor of that. Liz Stride, his third victim, was a survivor of that disaster. Hundreds died. It was the worst ever incident on the River Thames. It was again a collision like the 1989 Marchioness disaster, but on a bigger scale. Just waiting for this to load. Yeah, it's being a bit slow at the moment. But anyway, the map is interactive. It kind of uses little symbols. So if it's a fire, it shows flames. If it's a train crash, it shows a train, and so on. It's a very informative site, a very important site in my opinion for anyone interested in the history of London. So yeah, the Colney Hatch fire, it truly is a forgotten disaster. By the way, the fire of 1212, possibly as many as 3,000 people perished, although it's impossible to verify that for sure because obviously medieval sources are scant. But if true, that would be far worse than the fire of 1666, although we need to treat that with caution as well. Officially only 8 people died in the Great Fire of 1666, but it may be that many people were poor not registered because they didn't get treated in hospitals. Of course, this is long before the NHS, so it may be that they died from exposure, and of course there was ethnic violence afterwards. The French and Dutch were blamed, so it could be that the true toll of the fire of 1666 is higher. Just bear with me a second. I just want to talk more about that fire of 1649, or explosion rather. This includes terrorist attacks, it includes fires, it includes disasters, everything you can imagine, within the City of London, elsewhere. The Cornhill fire, 6 fatalities, 1748. This really is a great site. The Moorfields explosion, 17 killed in 1716. That was a munitions explosion. Yeah, there really is a lot that's, and I think the site's updated often. So the Clerkenwell Cinema fire, that's one of the most recent forgotten disasters. 1994, that was an arson attack, 11 killed. Anyway, I'll put a link to the site, let you look this up yourself, but it's a fantastic site. For anyone interested in London's history, of course the well-known things are also documented there, but it includes a lot of disasters that are not well documented. So thanks for watching. If you know anything more about this disaster, if you're a local historian, if you're from the London Borough of Barnet, let me know in the comments section. Feel free to share this video, but I just think it should be better known. I think there should be a memorial on the site or something. I mean, this was 52 innocent women died in the most horrible way, and I just think it should be better known.